Neil Bonnett wasn't born into privilege. He wasn't a polished superstar. He was a hard-nosed, blue-collar racer who fought his way into NASCAR. He was a loyal friend and was one of the most respected drivers of the 1980s. But after a violent crash nearly ended his career and his life, Neil Bonnett was forced to step away from racing. Doctors told him not to come back, friends worried about him, the risk was obvious. But racing wasn't just something Neil did, it was who he was. And when he tried to return, tragedy followed. This is the story of Neil Bonnett's rise, his brutal injuries, his comeback, and the heartbreaking end of a racer who simply couldn't walk away from the sport. Neil Bonnett grew up in Bessemer, Alabama, a working-class town built on steel, grit, and stubborn pride. He wasn't raised in a racing dynasty. Before he ever touched a stock car, he worked as a steelworker and a mechanic, learning how to build things with his hands and how to push through pain. Neil didn't buy his way into racing like many drivers do today. He built his own cars, worked in garages, and earned his first opportunities the same way that he approached everything else in life. Not with money, but with effort. Through local short tracks, Neil crossed paths with a tight-knit group of racers who would shape his entire life. This was the Alabama gang of Bobby Allison, Donnie Allison, and Red Farmer. They weren't just teammates, they were family. Help one, help all. And they saw something in Neil: toughness, intelligence, and a real racing instinct. By the late 1970s, Bonnett had earned his way into the NASCAR Cup Series. He wasn't hyped, he wasn't supposed to be a future star, but he outworked and outperformed expectations for him. Neil won races for some of the sport's most legendary teams like Junior Johnson and Associates and Wood Brothers Racing. Through the 1980s, he became one of the most consistent, respected racers in the garage. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't controversial, but he was the kind of driver other competitors trusted to race side by side at over 200 miles per hour. And along the way, Neil formed one of the closest friendships in NASCAR with Dale Earnhardt. These two shared similar roots, a similar toughness, and a deep respect that went far beyond racing. To many people, Dale and Neil weren't just friends, they were brothers. In 1990 at Darlington, everything changed for Neil. Neil suffered a massive crash that left
from several angles, so sit back here for the next few minutes and watch what happened between Ernie Irvan and Ken Schrader, which involved a lot of other cars eventually.
This had been going on for 2 laps. These guys have been side by side for 2 laps. And we've talked all day. This racetrack is tough. It's too tough to tame. And you just can't do it. We see Ernie got a little bit sideways. He bumps Schrader. They spin. There's Sterling Mullen runs in the back of the 6 car. And then he also hits the 4 car. Meanwhile, Jeff Bodine, they ran in the back of him, but he came through with not too much damage. Also, Morgan Shepherd, Dale Earnhardt.
With severe head injuries and lingering neurological symptoms. Back then, NASCAR had almost no concussion awareness, no formal medical evaluations, and enormous pressure for drivers to just tough it out. Neil at first tried to push through, but the symptoms didn't go away. Dizziness, headaches, cognitive effects. Back then, racers just called it getting your bell rung. The doctors eventually warned him that if he kept racing, the next hit may be his last. For the first time in his life, Neil was forced to do something he never imagined. He quit driving. He stepped out of the car and into the TV booth, becoming a commentator, still connected to the sport, but no longer inside the race car. For most drivers, that becomes a form of closure. But for Neil Bonnett, the itch never went away. Even after the years away from full-time competition, Neil stayed close to racing, testing cars with Dale Earnhardt and Richard Childress Racing, talking about setups, and helping teams while staying involved. In 1993 at Talladega, during the race, he was involved in another frightening crash. The wreck aggravated his existing head injuries and served him as a grim reminder. His body was never truly the same after 1990. He was still trying to recover, still trying to get past the long-term effects that few people in NASCAR fully understood at the time. There were no Hans devices, no neurological baselines, just toughness and denial. That Talladega crash made one thing painfully clear. Every time that Neil climbed into a race car, he was gambling with the injuries he already carried. But to Neil, that risk felt worth it, because for him, not racing hurt even worse. Through all of this, Neil never drifted away from Dale Earnhardt. The two remained inseparable, hunting together, testing cars, and spending time with their families together. Dale understood Neil better than most, the mentality of a racer who simply couldn't let go of the one thing that defined him. So when Neil started talking about a comeback, Earnhardt supported him, helping arrange test laps with Richard Childress Racing and easing Neil back behind the wheel in controlled conditions. This testing gave Neil hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the pain, the symptoms, and the doubt were all behind him. Hope that he could write one more chapter on his own terms. By early 1994, Neil Bonnett had lined up a car that was preparing to return for the Daytona 500. To friends, it felt like closure, but to Neil, this felt like coming home. In February of 1994, during a test session at Daytona, Bonnett was making practice laps in preparation for his comeback. Then, something went wrong. The car suddenly shot up the banking and slammed nearly head-on into the wall. At the time, there were no safer barriers, no modern head and neck restraints, just concrete and the momentum of the car. Neil Bonnett was killed instantly. The garage went silent. For Dale Earnhardt, the loss was crushing. He hadn't just lost a competitor, he'd lost a brother. And tragically, the sport would experience another crash on that same week when Rodney Orr was killed during qualifying. It was a dark and painful moment in NASCAR history, one that highlighted just how dangerous the sport was. Neil Bonnett's death became part of a difficult era in NASCAR where safety lagged far behind the risk. His story now sits inside of the larger timeline that would later push NASCAR towards improved cockpit protection, greater head injury awareness, and eventually massive safety reforms in the early 2000s. Neil Bonnett is remembered as a determined competitor, a fiercely loyal friend, and a man who tried to walk away but couldn't. Some people look at his story and see tragedy. Others see passion, devotion, and identity, a racer who simply didn't know how to be anything else besides a race car driver. In truth, those are both part of who Neil Bonnett was. Neil Bonnett didn't die chasing fame, he died chasing the thing he loved most. And like so many stories from this era of NASCAR, his life reminds us just how thin the line between glory and danger was. If you want to hear more stories from this era of NASCAR, learn about the safety changes, the drivers we lost, and the moments that have shaped the sport, I've got some more stories on my channel. Please consider subscribing. Thank you for watching.